Okay, as we know from our first lecture, as American settlers move west, they're doing so for a number of reasons. Whether it's the gold rush out in California, the allure of free land, or adventure, they start coming in droves in the mid-1800s. Now, the problem here is this is not some vast, empty grassland. It's inhabited by millions of settlers that came before the white Americans showed up in droves in the 1800s. And as you can see from this map, we have numbers of different Native American tribes. The Sioux, the Apache, the Shoshone, the Cheyenne, all holding land out here in the Great Plains. Now, inevitably, as the American settlers move west and they run into the Native Americans, conflict ensues. This is not a new thing. This has happened all the way back here when we're looking at the American South, even into the early part of American history back in the 1600s and 1700s. But as we expand westward and we run into the Native Americans, conflict erupts. Now, who's to blame for this? Is it entirely the white settlers' fault? Okay? And what actually drove these conflicts? And one of the big things here is the difference in the views of the land. For the American settlers moving west, they looked out here and they saw virtually an uninhabited field of grassland that was great for ranching, farming, prospecting, digging for gold, whatever it is that they were looking for. To them, this was just an open grassland. White settlers wanted to go out, they wanted to build a house, they wanted permanence, they wanted a fence, they wanted to put their cattle out there, they wanted to farm, they wanted to settle down. For the Native Americans, they do not have the same view of property. This is, to them, they have an area to hold. For the Sioux, it would be this area here. For the Cheyenne, right in there. But other than that, there is no individual property. They would chase and follow the buffalo throughout the Great Plains, and the buffalo provided to them almost everything they needed. Right? We see here buffalo, weapons, food, fuel, obviously protection, shelter, everything they can get from the buffalo. The buffalo was central to the life of the Plains Indians. They would follow the buffalo herds. They would migrate from place to place throughout the American West, chasing the buffalo herds. They knew where to go to gather fruits, vegetables, berries, etc., to supplement their diet. They were not farmers, but they knew where to go to collect different grains, etc. Okay. As more and more settlers move out here, we begin to encroach upon the Native American lands. When the Transcontinental Railroad comes through the northern part of the Great Plains, it's cutting across Sioux and Cheyenne territory. This is going to be a major driver of conflict. Now, why weren't the Native Americans and the white settlers coming out able to coexist? One of the big problems is that as American settlers move west, they keep changing the rules. Back in the 1830s, the American government basically said the entire Great Plains was one big Indian reservation. As gold is discovered out west and as people begin to move west, we want to change that. Okay? In 1864, one of the first major points of conflict, Sand Creek in Colorado, the American Army slaughters some 200 Native American settlers that actually come to a U.S. fort seeking protection and essentially agreeing to give up their sovereignty and be under the sway of the American government. A kind of a renegade American commander felt like he needed to make a name for himself and attack this essentially defenseless group, killing some 200 Native Americans. It was known as the Sand Creek Massacre. In 1868, we signed the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which again essentially cedes to the Sioux Indians, in this case, and the Cheyenne, vast territory to them that we would now protect from settlers coming out west. This was the idea of the Treaty of Fort Laramie, to bring peace between us and the Sioux, the strongest of the Native American tribes. One of the major leaders of the Sioux is Sitting Bull. In 1876, gold is discovered in the Black Hills in South Dakota. This is going to break, or now, because of this discovery of gold, a lot of Americans want to break the Treaty of Fort Laramie and open up these new Indian lands for Americans to come out and dig for gold. This is going to lead directly to the Battle of Little Bighorn, the most famous American Indian battle with the U.S. Army in history. At the Battle of Little Bighorn, the American 7th Cavalry, led by George Armstrong Custer, is completely wiped out. Custer graduated last in his class from West Point, although he also was the youngest general in American history. He led his troops into the battle, divided his forces, and they were systematically erased by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gall, the three most important Native American leaders of the Northern Plains. This is kind of the high water mark for the Native Americans. This is the one time when we look at a map showing all the Native American, all the different tribes, in which all these tribes kind of come together and unite to defeat their common enemy, the American Army. The Sioux and Cheyenne, the Crow, Battle of Little Bighorn is right here in southern Montana. They work together and they defeat the American Army. Shortly afterwards, they disperse and once again kind of divide themselves up into different Indian tribes, and they go their separate ways, and eventually, of course, this proves to be their ruin. The American Army capitalized and took advantage of the split between the different tribes whenever we could. When we noticed, some infighting between different tribes, we would definitely go in there and try to make sure we would exploit those advantages as much as we could. It works very well to our favor. Moment here about Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. Both were Sioux Indians. Both had grown up in a time when they were used to fighting the American Army. They became very respected war chiefs in the Sioux. Although they were from different branches of the Sioux tribes, but they will come together at the Battle of Little Bighorn to help defeat the American Army. Okay, the Indian Wars essentially come to an end in 1890 with the battle, if you want to call it that, or massacre at Wounded Knee, which is in modern-day South Dakota. Very reminiscent of the Sand Creek Massacre. The Native Americans had basically essentially given up at this point. They were starving, they were outnumbered, they were cold, and they had essentially nothing left. And they came to more or less surrender, and whether who fired first or whatever happens, a battle ensues in which most of the Native Americans are killed, and this effectively ends the Indian Wars in the American West. Now, the one thing the American government does to bring Battle of Wounded Knee, basically to a head, is we went on a systematic slaughter of the American buffalo. We talked about earlier how the buffalo was central to the life of the Plains Indians. When gold was discovered in California in 1848, there are roughly 40 million buffalo estimated roaming the Great Plains of the United States, all the way into Texas, all the way up into Canada. By 1890, there are less than 5,000. And the American government went on this was a mission to kill as many buffalo as they could, which they did very effectively. When the buffalo are wiped out, the Native Americans have nothing left, and that forces them to capitulate and to come to terms with the American government, which they tried to do at Wounded Knee, and essentially the Indian Wars will end. Now, with the conclusion of the Indian Wars, what do we do with the remaining Native Americans? In 1887, the Dawes Act was passed, which is going to establish different reservations all throughout the American West. We want to bring the Native Americans onto these reservations and Americanize them. We want to give them their own little plots of land, teach them how to farm, dress them in Western clothing, teach them English, put them in American schools, and assimilate them into American culture. The Dawes Act in these reservation systems is an abysmal failure, so much so that we can still see the effects on reservations today. Now, looking back in history, we like to look at it as one of the great scars of American history, the treatment of the Native Americans by the United States as we move west. Certainly, it is a black eye on our past. However, I also want to make sure we recognize the fact that the Native Americans, this was not some utopia where all these Native Americans just lived out here in harmony with each other. There was a number of conflicts between different Indian tribes, and the two greatest Native American tribes of the West, the Sioux and the Apache, had just grown into becoming kind of the superpowers of the Native Americans. The Sioux had earlier in their life, they were basically up here in southern Canada. They did not hold the great hunting grounds of buffalo, which would be kind of Montana, South Dakota, Wyoming. They were more further up here. They were the first Native American tribes to really adopt the horse and Western guns, which they were getting from trading with the British and French through Canada. That's going to give them a great advantage on other tribes, which they will then conquer to move into the great buffalo hunting grounds of the Great Plains. The same thing with the Apache down here in the south. They get the guns and the horses from the Spanish, and this gives them the advantage in the southwest. The Sioux had just moved into this area maybe 100 years before American settlers had moved into this area. So we like to think that we're encroaching upon this utopian world out here. It is not the case at all. It does not give us, does not excuse our actions with the Native Americans as we move west, but I do not want to make it look like the Native Americans live in this wonderful, wonderful utopia. Okay, that'll be it for today. Thank you very much.